Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome. I dare disrupt this wonderful fellowship. It is so good to be in this place together with all of you. As we bring our attention now, let us be glad to be with one another. This is the 2013 Schooler Institute. It is so good to have all of you here. Some of you were with us last evening. We began with worship, and it was just a wonderful evening as Bishop Palmer and a number of others brought that experience to us. We'll get started real quickly this morning. I have a couple of introductions. First, I want to share with you that Bishop Palmer began his assignment with the West Ohio Conference September 1, 2012. Many of you know this because before he was here, he was there in East Ohio. Good to have you back. But we have to go through the official. He served churches in North Carolina, the East Glenville and Werner. He served in Cleveland, James S. Thomas UMC in Canton, the United Methodist Church of Berea before his pastoral career. He was also the district superintendent of the Youngstown district. Bishop Palmer was elected to the episcopacy in 2000, served Iowa for 8 years, and then was assigned to the Illinois area, served Great Rivers. He was president of the Council of Bishops for 2 years. Probably a number of things we could say. Several people had stories that they thought maybe should be shared maybe another time based on some of the stories. I'll say one thing about Bishop Palmer. He's been present to us over the last number of months since he's been in the area. I've been grateful for that. But I had an experience with him a couple of weeks ago at a breakfast in the Columbus area, a breakfast that had a number of folks in attendance that are leaders in the Columbus area. And there were several of us at the bishop's table who saw folks that we thought the bishop should know. And we attempted to make introductions only to find out he already knew them. We have a tendency in some of our churches to look inward far more than we should, and to be about the matters of the church inside the walls. It's a wonderful thing that you are steps ahead of us in reaching out past those walls to the community and the world around us. Thank you for that. Look forward to your contributions later today. Dr. Marjorie Hewitt Suchocki is professor emerita at Claremont School of Theology. For many years, she taught theology and also served as academic dean. A United Methodist laywoman, she participates in numerous aspects of local, national, and international ministries of the denomination. She is the author of many books. Many of you know those. We won't list them all here. She is co-director currently of the Center for Process Studies at Claremont. She's worked with the Whitehead International Film Festival. You can read more about her. You can Google her if you like. What you may not find is this woman loves rocks. Gems, stones, jewels, rocks. Just came back from a time in the desert in Arizona looking for more rocks. Now, if we had time, we would pose the question, what is it about serving in a seminary community for myriad years that causes one, upon retirement, to want to spend time with rocks? Now, as a proponent of process thought and a theologian who's interested in things relational and dynamic, she would probably tell us they're not just rocks. Good to have you here. I've encountered you a number of ways over the years in the classroom, using your works in local churches. It's wonderful to know that your presence is as it has been in the books. Good to have you here. Welcome, everybody.
Now, about rocks, everybody. Do you know they actually are in motion? I mean, there's just these wonderful things about them, that while they look solid and everything, they're just dynamic buzzings of activity inside, and rocks actually move. This is true. I've been studying geology. Anybody who loves rocks will study geology. And rocks move, especially in the asthenosphere. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Anyhow, I'm really glad to be back here at Methesco. You've been dear to my heart. I was here a bunch of years ago doing lectures on movies or something, and then when I was invited back and learned that my very own cousin was going to be here as bishop. And those of you who weren't here last night need to know that I was born Marjorie Hewitt. That was my maiden name. So I come from a long line of Hewitts. And then I found out that Bishop Palmer's mother's last name, before she got married to Mr. Palmer, was Hewitt. So clearly we're related. And I call him Cuz, anyhow. But, you know, Bishop Cuz, I mean. Now, I'm going to give you a lecture on something that's been dear to my heart for these past couple of years, and this is a fascination with the notion of the omnipresence of God. Because it occurred to me, not many people talk about the omnipresence of God. And then I began thinking about it historically, and I hate to tell you this, but you're going to really know you're back in the seminary. Because the first half of this lecture, which is about preaching and omnipresence, the first half is just strictly academic. You can handle it. You're back in the classroom, okay? And then I'm going to get us to preaching, which is much more in your realm. But I think it's important for persons in ministry to keep aware of the long history of Christian thought and the evolution of Christian thought and some of the byways and ways that Christian thought takes that affects and shapes how we do ministry. How you understand God affects your ministry, right? Now, I'm going to argue that theology has taken a quiet turn in the past half century, so quiet as to be hardly noticed at all. For centuries of Christian history, the dominant category for understanding God was the notion of omnipotence. God is omnipotent. We love the omnipotence of God. And omniscience and omnipresent, you know there were three qualities: omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, right? Those are the three omnis that describe God, right? And they're supposedly of equal importance, and sometimes we throw in a fourth, omnibenevolent, so that God is understood as these things. John Wesley, in his sermon on omnipresence, and indeed in his entire life, ministry, and writings, apparently makes a shift from this dominance of omnipotence to a dominance of omnipresence, which precedes by 200 years a similar shift beginning in the 20th century. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to give you a brief history of the church's thinking of omnipresence and then ask the question: if we take the omnipresence of God seriously, how does it affect the way we preach? Because my suspicion is we have thought much more strongly about the power of God than we have of the presence of God. Omnipresence. As early as the formation of the Apostles' Creed, whose antecedents are already in the 2nd century, we see the dominance of omnipotence. Now, this is a very little creed. It's only this long, right? 3 paragraphs. The middle one's a little long, but the first and the third, they're gone before you notice them. Very little creed. But listen, 2 times in this creed, there's a reference to God's omnipotence. Now, just to show you how learned I am, I'm going to give you these 2 quotations in Latin, which you will all understand. And this morning, when the Pope announced his resignation in Latin, most of the cardinals didn't know what he was talking about. And I know that none of you are going to complain about my pronunciation because you won't know how it ought to be pronounced either. Okay, but this is why I'm reading it in Latin, because omnipotence comes out so well. Listen. Begins, Credo in Deum Patrem omnipotentem. Well, you recognize that last word, right? We believe in God the Father Almighty. Omnipotentem, first line of the creed. And then we end the 2nd paragraph once again with, now listen to this one, and maybe you'll know which one it is. Sedet ad dexterum Patris omnipotentis. Sitteth at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Now see, if you were regularly used to Latin, you would have noticed immediately omnipotence becomes the importance. And that's why I read it in Latin. Because if I just said the Father Almighty, you're so used to it, you don't even notice, oh yes, that's omnipotent. When does the Creed mention the omniscience of God? Not at all. What about mentioning something as important as the omnipresence of God? No way. Omnipotence, twice. This little creed. Omnipotence was the dominant category through which the church understood omniscience and omnipresence. They weren't equal. Omnipotence was over them. There's not, well, I already said that. So, omnipresence expressed the power of God sometimes as a localized power, other times as a power of majesty. Omniscience was important because an all-powerful God had to know all things, otherwise the power of God would be suspect, right? So omniscience and omnipresence were understood through the category of God's power. As such, strange twists and turns happened in Christian history, particularly with regard to the knowledge of God, or omniscience. The most thorny one had to do with resolving the conflict between omniscience and human freedom. Now, you probably have studied this once or twice. If God's power is absolute, how is there room for human freedom? Omnipotence means not just all-powerful, but all power. Well, if God has all the power, what about human freedom? Does God have power over human freedom? And if you say no, you're theologically incorrect. Because all power means all power. You know, all means all, right? Well, you know, that was just an aside. If there's no real human freedom, here comes the next problem. How is there justice in punishing people for doing that which they are predestined to do? Predestination and theodicy, which means the justification of God in light of the problem of evil. Predestination and theodicy are the two major theological issues that evolved from conjoining omniscience to omnipotence, and to understanding omniscience in and through an omnipotent, not only all-powerful, but all power belonging to God. These became irresolvable. With regard to omnipresence, the major problem had to do with reconciling the presence of God with the immateriality of God. How can something that's only spirit be present when in fact presence involves, you know, we can step on a scale and discover how much we weigh. Well, God can't step on a scale and discover how much God weighs, because God is immaterial. Well, then how can something that's immaterial be present at all? This was a problem. Anselm, in the 11th century, I knew you'd know immediately I would go to Anselm. He dealt with the problem, and he made a distinction between being in space and being circumscribed by place, which may seem like a very strange, little tiny distinction to you, but it helps him resolve the problem. It suggested that God is present to space, but certainly not in space. Anselm also compared the presence of God in the world to the presence of a king's power throughout the king's realm. There is no place within the kingdom that is not subject to the king's power. Therefore, the king is said to be present throughout the realm in and through his power. Hence, omnipresence, like omniscience, is fundamentally interpreted through omnipotence. Omnipotence determines the way we understand God's presence. God is present by God's power. Now, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas picks up a similar notion when he deals with omnipresence, holding that God's presence is to be understood through God's power. This is what he writes. God is in all things by his power, inasmuch as all things are subject to his power. Does that sound like you're interpreting omnipresence in and through the dominant category of omnipotence? The answer is yes. You can nod your heads. Summa Theologica 183. Isn't that impressive? Now, we get to my favorite theologian. Yet, my favorite theologian. You thought it was John Cobb. I dearly love John Cobb, but my favorite theologian is John Wesley. Writing in the 18th century, he bases a sermon on the text in Jeremiah 23:24. I asked it. In fact, I asked if people would ask him to read it. I don't know if they did. Did you read this sermon by John? love John Wesley. Here's the quote. "Do I not fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord?" Wesley bemoans the fact that so little has been written historically on the divine omnipresence, as well he should, given the overwhelming amount of material written on both omnipotence and omniscience, and relatively little on God's omnipresence. Omniscience, of course, raised that horrible conflict between God's foreknowledge and human freedom, causing volumes of theology attempting to resolve this issue. They kept writing about it because nobody could finally resolve it. Every time it was resolved, somebody picked a hole in it, and they had to be resolved all over again. That's the way theology works. But omnipresence was far less controversial, and consequently, it didn't receive much treatment. It's not much written strictly on omnipresence, except for John Wesley. Whereas both Anselm and Aquinas write of omnipresence in terms of the spatial presence of God, Wesley uses the Jeremiah text to deny the relevance of spatiality at all. He says, "The presence or absence of any or all creatures makes no difference. God is equally in all." And Wesley also imagines the universe as a whole. Is God contained inside the universe? Does the universe even have an outside? Is there a little picket fence going around the universe? This is inside it and that's outside it? What's outside the universe? Does the universe have an outside? What does outside mean if you have a universe? It doesn't matter, says Wesley, so don't worry about it. Wesley says, "Space exists beyond the bounds of creation. Even that space cannot exclude the one who fills the heaven and the earth." Isn't he wonderful? You should read him more often. He's terrific. Now, Wesley makes omnipresence the basis of omnipotence, not the consequent of omnipotence. Listen, Wesley, if there were any space where God was not present, God would not be able to do anything there. Therefore, to deny the omnipresence of God, says Wesley, implies likewise the denial of God's omnipotence. Do you hear what he's done? He's turned it upside down. He's made omnipresence the basis of God's power. That's very different. But he doesn't go so far as to question whether or not God's omnipresence as the foundation of God's power in any way changes or shapes how we understand God's power. Now, he doesn't actually ask those questions, but I'm going to argue this afternoon that in fact he does reshape how we understand God's power. And you can name it with one word: grace. For Wesley, God is understood to be powerful in and through God's grace, which is itself the corollary of the omnipresence of God. So this afternoon we'll look at omnipresence and grace almost interchangeably. That's the power of God, the grace of God. No wonder he's my favorite theologian. He should be yours too. He probably is. Now, in the 20th century, there were two movements: liberation theologies and, dare I say it, process theologies, that not only make God's omnipresence central, but also begin explicitly to reshape the understanding of God's power, conceiving God's power as a power of presence. Have you ever noticed the power of presence? I know you have. The most amazing way to realize it is when you're in awful grief. You know those times when you have to endure grief and someone comes and stays with you? And they not say anything, but there's such a power in that presence. There's a power in God's presence in all of our times. Well, liberation theology. It began in South America in the 1950s and in the 1960s, and it received its major theological formulation in 1971 by the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez in his book, A Theology of Liberation. The focus of this book is on the poor and on the unjust social structures that make for poverty. In 1986, Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff published Ecclesiogenesis. There were more parishes, he argues, than there were priests within the Roman Catholic Church in Brazil. And because a priest had to be present in order for the Eucharist to be celebrated, that meant that parishes in remote parts of Brazil were virtually without access to the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is absolutely central within Roman Catholicism, as indeed it is within Protestantism as well. But in Roman Catholicism, not to have access to the Eucharist was almost not to have access to Christ. It was a terrible lack. And Leonardo Boff argues in Ecclesiogenesis that it is God who gives sacramental power within the Eucharist, and the priest is but a vehicle of God's power, because God is present in and to the parish, regardless of whether there is a priest there or not. God can and does raise up persons from among the laity, whom God then empowers to offer the Eucharist, in which God in Christ is literally present, even though no word has announced the words of transfiguration. God's power is a power of presence. Now, the power of presence is empowering. This fundamental key to all liberation theologies expanded from South America, Protestant as well as Roman Catholic theologies, United Methodists also in South America. It expands into Central and North America, into Black, Latino, Latina, and feminist liberation theologies. It also moves into the emerging power, the emerging theologies of hope in Europe. A tremendous shift caused by the movement of liberation theology, refocusing the understanding of God's power as a power of presence. Empowerment had social as well as theological consequences, as can be noted in liberation theology's mantra. You can probably recite it. God's preferential option for the poor. Those without access to political, ecclesiastical, or social power are empowered by God to effect political, ecclesiastical, and social change that will lead to greater well-being among all people. The empowering presence of God among the people received Christological affirmation as the figure of Christ came to be represented in new ways. Suddenly, the traditionally Anglo representations of Christ, Solomon's head of Christ, remember it? In paintings and sculpture, gave way to many forms. The black Christ appears, and then even the female Christ as Christa made their way into art. Nativity scenes begin to be not just a nice little white family, but nativity scenes begin to be portrayed both in sculpture and in art in every different ethnicity, of color of skin, qualities of features all around the world. This Christmas I was in Dallas and we went to the gardens there, and there was a big exhibit of nativities in their central house, I guess it is. Anyhow, I was mind-boggled seeing these wonderful portrayals of Christ in every race and color on earth. It's marvelous. The power of God with us. God's presence took on an identity that in turn empowered a new dignity, a new courage for what feminists called a place at the table. And the other form of 20th century theology that turned toward the importance of God's presence was process theologies. Whereas liberation theologies emerged from social issues, process emerged from changes in the scientific understanding of the world. There were new findings in relativity physics that led philosopher-physicist Alfred North Whitehead to ask this question. Well, if these things are so, what must the structure of the world be like? If this intense relationality at the subatomic level of existence, this dynamism, this intense relationality, so that everything that exists does so in and through its relation to everything else, what must be the structure of existence if this is true? It was a profound question. And so he develops an answer by developing a series of, he developed this process philosophy, right? And the crazy thing is, being a very eminent philosopher, physicist, mathematician, he was invited to give these lectures that, in Scotland that were very, very prestigious. And when he gave his first lecture, the crowd filled the room. By the time he got to the last lecture, he was lecturing Process and Reality. I don't know if you've ever read it. By the time he got to the last lecture, there were 5 people there. So I was initially going to describe to you exactly what process theology was, and then I thought about the 5 people, and I thought, well, maybe I'll just brush over that. All you really need to know is this, that the role of God, as Whitehead's developing it, and he's not developing it as a theologian. I do the theology. He did the philosophy. A lot of us do the theology, but it's the philosophy basically. And how does God get in there? Because he couldn't understand the structure of the existence without understanding, in some sense, the role of God in existence. And the role of God, very quickly, is this. God is the power of possibility that comes to you in every single moment of your life. And not only that, but remember, he's talking about the subatomic level. Nothing exists without the power of God calling everything that is in the process of becoming, calling it into a future that it and only it can fulfill. God is the power of the presence offering us a future and enabling us to achieve it. Now, that little definition I just gave you, you should put a little bracket around it, because you know what? That's also the definition of Wesley's understanding of grace. Really. God is the power of a presence which offers us a future and gives us the power to move toward it. See? 1 minute, process theology. You've got it all. See, I'm skipping over all that. This very brief summary of what, in fact, is a quite complex system is sufficient to show you that the presence of God is fundamental in process thought to both the power and the wisdom of God. Often process philosophers and theologians speak of God's power as, persuasive rather than coercive. God's power is persuasive, not coercive. In omnipotence was king. God's power was coercive. That's why there was so much trouble trying to figure out how there could be human freedom and God at the same time. How God could justly condemn the human race for that which he could not possibly not do. For in process thought and in liberation thought, God's power is persuasive and enabling rather than coercive and determinative. God does not control all things. God persuades all things. Now, before you gasp and say, what do you mean God doesn't control all things? Really, tell me why Newtown happened if God controls all things. You know, did God plan for that to happen? And you will probably have to answer, probably not. God persuades all things, not controls all things. Thus, the issue of theodicy is considerably lessened. The world is responsible for what it does with what it has received. God has not foreordained it. God did not foreordain Newtown. The issue of divine knowledge is also addressed. God's knowledge is perfect because God knows all things as they are. God knows the past as past. And since in a process world every actuality receives as well as gives, God continuously receives each completed actuality into the divine self. This would have become, for a Methodist theologian, what Wesley talks about as glorifying grace. God knows within God's own self everything received into God as it could have been and as it became. One could say that God knows the past more fully than the past could ever have known itself. The present, relative to every becoming entity, is its way of integrating what it has received. It is alone within itself during its becoming. God knows it immediately upon its completion, and based upon the fullness of God's knowledge of past, and to the extent that it can be known, the becoming entity, God knows all the probabilities of the future. Given the presence of all possibility within God, God knows all possibilities whatsoever, those that are relevant and those that are irrelevant to any becoming world, to any becoming occasion, to any becoming person. God, in classical portrayals, God had to know everything as if it had already happened. In process thought, God knows the actual is actual, the probable is probable, and the possible is possible. To know a thing as if it existed when in fact it has not existed would in process terms not be knowledge at all. It would be error. God's knowledge is perfect, not because it sees the entire world as a whole as if it had already happened, because it hasn't already happened. God's power is perfect because God knows the world as it has been, as it is, and as it can be. That's perfect knowledge. In many respects, process theologies make explicit that which is metaphysically implicit within liberation theologies, and indeed in the Wesleyan theology suggested in the sermon that Wesley preached on the omnipresence of God. When divine presence is the basis of God's power, then the old metaphor of earthly rulers as the exemplar of divine power must give way. Your dominant image of God should not be that of a king who controls everything, whose power goes throughout the whole kingly realm and therefore defines God's presence. And when God's knowledge is based on God's omnipresence, then this knowledge is not a foreordaining power, neither to damnation nor salvation nor to anything else. Rather, it is a fullness of knowledge that knows all things as they are and as they can be or as they could have been. It is a knowledge with reality and not over reality. It is a knowledge that is concomitant with God's presence. So I turn now, maybe I shouldn't have skipped over so much process, but that's all right. So now I turn to a discussion of preaching, and I ask the question, what are the implications for contemporary modes of preaching if we base preaching on the omnipresence of God? Well, section 2, preaching. Preaching the Word of God, both to Christians and to those who are not Christian, has been a part of Christianity for as long as Christianity has existed. Even the Christ, our Lord Jesus, preached, whether in a sermon given on a mount, in parables, or in discourses, with this fundamental difference from the various preachings that we do. We preach the Word. Christ was, Christ is the Word. He himself is sermon to us, and that which he preached and taught came from the profundity through which he was and is and always will be the manifestation in time of the God who is always present. So how do we preach Christ today within this context of the omnipresent God, always with us, always with all creation? And I suggest that there are several essential assumptions which should undergird your preaching. 1, hear this, so simple. God's presence is not limited to the preacher. Isn't that profound? Nor to the congregation, nor to Christians. Omnipresence means omnipresence. There is nowhere where God is not. 2, to say the same thing in a positive way, God is present with you, the preacher, and with every single person in the congregation, and God is present indeed with all creation throughout the universe. And along with Wesley, I'd say if there were an outside to the universe, God would be present there too. 3, this is the most important. God's presence is empowering for you, for the congregation, for all. So then, how do these 3 assumptions affect your preparation for preaching? So I'm going to stay with 3s. That, after all, is what you learned in homiletics class. There are always 3. First, there are 3 moments to preaching in the presence of God. These moments are before, during, and after. Doesn't my profundity astound you? Or you must think about your sermon in preparation, delivery, and letting go. With regard to preparation, you are not developing a sermon that you will later submit to God in an annual report concerning how you conducted your ministry. God is present. You are in the presence of the very God you preach, even as you prepare to preach. One of the difficulties of omnipresence is that we are so accustomed to the presence of God that we hardly notice it. In many respects, this is quite functional. After all, remember yesterday's lectionary text? Moses had to cover his face with a veil to protect himself from the brightness of God. For us, everydayness is like a veil that we use to cover our faces from the reality that the God we serve is not off someplace else, but is present here in this very room. There is a fullness to the presence of God that we are so used to that, can you believe it? We hardly notice it. And every now and then we do, and it knocks you off your rocker. Begin your preparations by recalling your soul to the presence of God, even as you prepare. Now, if you were preparing a sermon that you would preach in the presence of the Council of Bishops, just imagine the care that would go into your preparation. And if Bishop Palmer were present in your study with you as you set about the task of writing the sermon, perhaps quietly counseling you, can't you imagine that you might even tremble a bit as you worked with the intense discipline and diligence to find just what you must say about a text? Brothers and sisters, it is not Bishop Palmer, nor even the whole Council of Bishops who is present with you and to you as you prepare to preach. It is God's own awesome, holy self. You take seriously God's empowering presence with you as you prepare your sermon. And then I guarantee that you will indeed approach your preparation prayerfully, bringing your consciousness of God into awareness as you work. And what do you owe God as you work? Time, of course. It takes time to study a text, no matter how well you know it, how often you have preached upon it in lectionary cycle after lectionary cycle. The times have changed since you last preached it, and is no longer the same text. It's a text in the context of today. It is a text newly infused with the ever-present presence of God. It's not the same text you preached before. And it takes time to research the text. You owe it to God and you owe it to your congregation, not to mention you owe it to yourself, to know something of how this text has functioned historically. You may think you know it, excuse me, you may think that you know what this text has always meant, and I assure you, you do not. Use that wonderful new tool, the web, to check out how theologians and preachers have used this text in history. I was imagining as I came over. Next week's text is Luke 4, 1 through 11. I wonder if what you could do, see, I didn't think of this earlier, but what if you could type in on your iPad or your computer, Luke 4, 1 to 11, and Thomas Aquinas? What would come up on your iPad? Maybe what would come up on your iPad would be some paragraph or two from the Summa Theologica in which Thomas is actually preaching. What if you did Luke 4, 1 to 10, John Wesley? Would it show you what John Wesley thought about this text? What if you went back further and further in time? Go back to Augustine. He read the Bible too, you know. What did he think about this text? And when you go back all these ways and see all these people, just go back to your church history notes and you'll find out who to look up. Oh, thank you so much. How kind you are. Presence. God is present. In and through one another, for sure. Okay. Watch me knock it over. Anyhow, learn as much as you can. You know, you never did learn enough in seminary. You really didn't. Sermon preparation is the time when you continue your own education, earning the right to be known as a learned pastor, responsible to your congregation, responsible to a text, responsible for a text. A deep importance for your congregation as you research the text through history is that you will discover and help them to discover that Christian interpretations of the text and resultant theologies have evolved in these 2,000 years of our faith. Even the same words can mean very different things over the centuries, and context always factors into the understanding of any text. Even so central a concept as atonement has numerous meanings. You think atonement is clearly understood and it always means the same thing in every time and place, because that's what Christianity is about, right? The atonement of Christ that happens, God's atonement for us. You think that's the same through history? And now you know enough to say, no, it's not the same through history, Marjorie, we know that. In case you forgot, let me tell you about a couple of different interpretations. Do you know what it is in Augustine's writing? It's ransom from Satan. Do you know how that works? God tricks Satan. God does. God tricks Satan in Augustine's writing. God tricks Satan into taking Jesus in place of us, right? But then Satan, oh no, says Satan, I can't take you. I mean, he already gulps Jesus down, right? He takes the bait. But then the trick is, Jesus can't die because Jesus is God. And so naturally there's a resurrection. And it turns out that everybody who believes in Christ gets resurrected right along out of the jaws of Satan. And this is atonement. I bet you haven't preached that recently. Yeah. Well, here's several centuries later. How about Anselm of Canterbury? I already quoted him on one thing. His understanding of atonement is quite different because he lived in a feudalistic society. And every serf owed a liege lord total obedience. Should the serfs fail in any respect, they had to make satisfaction in a way that was equal to what they had done wrong. Here's the problem, says Anselm. God is our infinite liege lord. And through every sin we commit, we have offended God. But since God is infinite, the satisfaction has to be infinite too. But you're finite. You can't make an infinite satisfaction. Too bad for you. And there's no way out. Luckily, God had this idea. God would become finite. And then, but God becoming finite doesn't mean God stops being infinite. So God is both finite and infinite. Then, as finite, which means as a human being, God can then die for us, right? And as finite, it's appropriate because he's also infinite. Therefore, it's an infinite satisfaction made by a finite man. When did you last preach this one? Okay. A century later, Peter of Abelard gives yet another interpretation. Our problem, he says, is our profound ignorance. Now, this one you might believe. We are profoundly ignorant, both morally and intellectually, and we know not what we are called to be. God became incarnate as the Christ in order to be our teacher, showing us the way. And his teaching, this almost sounds 21st century, his teaching is empowering, enabling us to follow him. Well, several centuries later, you have the reformers arguing that we are sinners in the dock of God's courtroom and Jesus is our advocate. When we are pronounced sinners, our advocate says, wait, don't take them off yet. I, their lawyer, will take their place. You can let them go. I mean, you only require a punishment, right? Well, punish me instead. They can go. And the judge says, okay. Well, anyhow, that's called the substitutionary theory of the atonement. You may have preached this one. It's very popular in many televangelists today. Now, 2 centuries later, our very own John Wesley understands the atoning blood of Christ to be the basis of God's pardon for sin, enabling us to get on with the work of what God intended us to be all the time, which is sanctification. And sanctification, of course, is just a fancy word to mean growth in the love of God. Growth in the love of God. Pardon for sin releases us for growth in the love of God. You might have preached that. And if you didn't, you should. More than a century beyond Wesley, Schleiermacher argued that our plight is that we are but infants in our evolutionary history, and the physical outweighs the spiritual. We cannot attain that to which God calls us, but Jesus, the God-man, completes our humanity for us with his absolute dependence on God through his total God consciousness. And by being united with Christ in faith, we are empowered to live as the spiritual, physical persons that God calls us to be. Now, this is a very brief history, but I just want you to see through it that concepts that we think are so familiar, in fact, have been changing through the centuries. It should make you a little humble in your profound certainties that everything you believe is absolutely correct. What you believe is one version. Now, if I said, which one of these was the Christian theory, you'd have to say all of them. Because I have just recited for you very briefly some of the major giants of Christian thinking. And it's not that one was Christian and the others weren't. It's that, in fact, there is an evolution in the way we think theologically. And in fact, maybe God even knows about that. And maybe God fits us to our context as well as to a text, so that what we say makes sense to the people around us and becomes an empowering message for them that can release them from whatever is binding them. It's no surprise to God that there are varieties of theories of the atonement, and maybe your theory is another one. But see it as standing along a large company of saints. And your people should know, too, that there is this evolution of thought within Christian history that, in fact, is God-inspired. And maybe the way we say it now sounds really weird to 21st century, but can you imagine how the way we think it today is going to look 5 centuries from now? We'll just be another one in the theory, because God is faithfully present to every generation, helping us to understand the Word of God according to the times in which God has placed us, and in which God calls us to growth in the love of God. All the persons I cited were working with the same text that you read, that I read, but within very different contexts, and where I've illustrated the movement in theology and biblical understanding with regard to atonement, the same evolution in doctrine is the case throughout our history. You should know that, uncovered in your study. The notion of sin has changed dramatically over time. Your congregation needs to know it too, hearing it in your sermons and studying it for themselves. You and they will become more patient with the diversities of thinking in our present church. You will be more patient and more comfortable with diversity in our own time when you know there has always been diversity. God can work through more than one way of understanding the Bible and expressing theological insight. And you know that just because we as United Methodists are an ecumenical church. What does that mean? It means that we can understand that God can work in more ways than just those that are United Methodist. But at the same time, you better thank God that you're a United Methodist. Knowing this is exceedingly important to what Wesley called a Catholic spirit, recognizing that there is more than one way to interpret God's work, and this in turn leads to that gift of the Spirit known as forbearance with one another in our differences, patience with oneself and others, and to humility in the gospel. From this period of study, see all the things you've been doing in that little room of yours? In that period of study, then write your sermon, either in outline form or in finished form, according to that which works best for you, and incorporate some of your historical learnings so that your congregation can also understand the storied nature of our faith. And then, because God is listening, preach the sermon in your head and let it be a prayer. Sunday comes. It always does. The second moment in preaching. You will deliver this sermon, as you prepared this sermon, in the presence of God, as an offering, as a spiritual gift given back to God. Your sermon is your gift to God from the empowering presence of God in your study. And where, of course, is the God to whom you offer it? Well, with you, of course, and also with every person in the congregation. If the sense of God's presence with you in your preparation time had the power to induce a sense of maybe fear and trembling, and sometimes you ought to have a sense of fear and trembling, God is God. I suspect you will notice that the actual offering of the sermon transforms fear and trembling into confidence and power. Not a coercive power over the congregation, but a witness power in the Spirit. You are giving the sermon that has been given to you through your wrestling with the sermon in God's presence in the first place. So you give the sermon in the confidence that God will use it. If the preparation of the sermon was its first moment, then the actual preaching of the sermon is its second moment. And so you conclude the sermon knowing it's not yet over. There is a third moment to come. How does knowing there is a third moment affect your conclusion? Some homileticians argue for a forceful conclusion, a kind of grand finale, the fireworks going off at the end of a, what's that overture that Tchaikovsky wrote? You know, that one. Like that. Okay. 1814. 1812. Others argue for a more open-ended conclusion, expecting something from the congregation as well. Preaching a 3-moment sermon in the presence of God rather argues for the second approach, that there's more to the sermon now that you've finished preaching it that has to come. But I suspect either one could be appropriate, either the grand finale or the waiting for what comes next, depending on the content and the context of the sermon. Regardless of how you end your sermon, your part in the preaching moment is now done. And the third moment begins. It's time for you to let go. God is present, not as a hovering spirit over the congregation as you preach, but as a real presence, present to each and every person there. This, of course, is no different from the everydayness. The omnipresent God is always with everyone, always present, calling them to their own and to the communal well-being. God is always present. The only difference between God's presence with people before and during church is that the church, in some sense, can lift the veil of everydayness, evoking a consciousness of God's presence. But whether it does or not, God is there anyhow, continually working in the lives of your people. Now, I am well aware that sometimes it's mighty hard to discern the working of God in the lives of the congregation, or even in a whole denomination, or any of you at General Conference. Comes down to this. God is omnipresent, specifically present to everything and everyone whatsoever. And this certainly includes the persons in your congregation. And God's presence empowers persons to grow in love. More of this when we move to grace in the afternoon. Whether or not people do grow in love is variable in a world where God works not by coercion, but by persuasion. Not by force, but by enabling grace, by offering to each a reflection, bright or dim, of God's own love. The purpose of your sermon is to evoke a spiritual sensitivity to the presence of God through this text, in this time, in this place, in this wider community, in this world. What God will do with your sermon once delivered is, in a holy sense, none of your business. Rather, it now enters into God's arsenal of means to effect growth in love within the hearer. God completes your sermon within the lives of the hearers in ways that might surprise you because you didn't think you preached that at all. You've found that already, haven't you? Yes, I know you have. That's all right. This is now God's work. Your part is finished. Breathe a prayer and let the sermon go. Trust it to God and say amen. There's just no telling what will happen next. And besides, you have all those things to get done before it's time to set aside the holy work of preparation and begin it all again. Sunday's going to happen next week too. So let it go and start it all over again. How? In God's presence, of course. Now, that's the end of that, so you can back. Okay. Now you can stop clapping, because now we're moving into the second type of thing. You're going to have these table talks later on, and you're going to say, what are we going to talk about in table talk? Well, I'll tell you what you're going to talk about, because I'm supposed to give you guiding notions, right? This is it. These are your sermon texts for next week. If you follow the lectionary, and if you don't, you might try it. Okay? From the Old Testament, it's Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11. From the Psalms, it's Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2, and 9 through 16. In Romans, it's 10, 8b to 13. And in Luke, it's chapter 4, 1 to 13. I want you to either begin or continue your sermon preparation. And if some of you don't happen to be preaching a sermon next week, never mind, try it anyhow. Pretend you are. When you go to your table talk, I want you to begin thinking together with others in God's presence about how you might approach these texts. Goodbye. See you later.